Welcome to the Mobile Games Playbook, in association with Liftoff. Join us as we uncover the latest trends in user acquisition, monetization, and mobile game design.
Hello, and welcome to the Mobile Games Playbook. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. This is a podcast all about what makes a great mobile game, what is and isn't working for mobile game designers, and all of the latest trends. I'm your host, Jordan, and joining me today we have one expert, but what an expert he is, Teemu Palomäki. Good to have you back on, Teemu. And your official title is Chief Game Analyst Japan for Game Refinery, and you are talking about one of the most defining, I guess, Japanese games today. So this is you are the perfect man for this. So tell us what we're talking about today.
So, Final Fantasy. Great to be here talking about it. I've played a lot of them, so I'm hoping I will be able to maybe shed some light on things that could be helpful for also non-Final Fantasy developers today.
It's a massive subject. I think it's one of the longest running. I mean, whether you see it as a sort of an interesting sort of franchise, isn't it? Because there's pretty much most of the games are sort of single games, but sort of to some degree in some sort of shared universe. And then there are sort of some direct sequels, but then there's an awful lot of sort of side quests and multimedia, and over time that's become bigger. So very interesting from that point of view. But and also we have sort of we're sort of timing this now because Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis has fairly recently been released as a mobile game. So again, that's a sort of another retelling of the sort of classic Final Fantasy VII game as well. So that'll be something we'll cover. But how do you want to start?
I'm thinking first, kind of what makes Final Fantasy maybe so special. Thinking about it, obviously, like you mentioned, there's sort of connections. Some follow from the or follow in the same universe, while most of them are totally different and maybe share only like gameplay mechanics or like themes. And I think that's sort of what makes it so good, at least for me, the way they can keep things fresh. So if I've played Final Fantasy VII, which is sort of sci-fi world, and then I go play Final Fantasy 16, which is the latest one for PlayStation 5, which is sort of Game of Thrones, like medieval Europe thing. Those don't have much in common, like if you look at them like that. But when I'm playing them, there are these elements that make them familiar and easier to approach. And I think that's the way the series evolves, is the way that it catches people's attention and keeps them interested in it for a long time.
I guess there's always the view that unless you really don't like RPGs, which clearly that's not the franchise view then. But if you do, obviously you'll have a favourite, but you'll probably have one or a couple of games that you really sort of like historically because the story really worked, or for more modern ones it's just sort of something that really sort of chime with you, and that means you'll sort of always be interested in the next one, even if you sort of the setting isn't something that you like, or for some reason you don't sort of like the one. So I guess it's sort of an interesting sort of almost, it's just a very basic sort of advertising sort of that's one of the reasons it's lasted so well. Obviously the quality of the games has been great, but anyone who's ever played a Final Fantasy game and liked part of it is like, well, I wonder what this next one's going to be like, and it seems to sometimes, like we used to say, sort of with sort of James Bond films back in the day, where everyone would always watch the next one, even if the last one was rubbish. There's always that sort of idea. Some of the Final Fantasy games are really actually not going to be very good, but there's enough good stuff in there that you just like, well, this one, they've learned from their mistakes before.
There is, and well, mainline Final Fantasy. So obviously there are games that are considered massive hits. 7, I think 10 would count as a massive hit. I think 16 is being a really good hit right now, despite the kind of smaller install base on PlayStation 5. But there are those that people consider misses, like Final Fantasy VIII was a little bit off-putting for many, and 13 is always getting a lot of hate from the fan base. And that's the main line, and that is also the case on like the mobile games, the spin-offs that are on mobile. There's been a lot of really weird ones that have not resonated at all. You know, one example was the Final Fantasy All the Bravest, where you just had a ton of different characters, no story, no anything. It's just monetization and like not really much to do. There's just a lot of effects happening on the screen, and players really didn't like that one. And there's been like spin-offs from the Final Fantasy Type Zero game. There was the Agito game about school setting. Since Type Zero didn't resonate well with the players, the spin-off didn't resonate either. So yeah, there's been a lot of misses. Most recently, the Final Fantasy VII First Soldier. You might remember the Battle Royale game. I think it lasted only 4 months before it was killed because it was trying to do something a bit ambitious. And personally, I kind of liked the gameplay, what they introduced to the like Battle Royale, you know, setting. The way you can kill monsters, you can choose to go like PvE to focus on the monsters, or PvP and try to kill the players. It was interesting. It was fresh, but the game just didn't keep me hooked long enough, and it seems like it didn't find its audience at all.
I guess generally would we say, comparing the sort of the mobile ones to the non-mobile ones, that obviously clearly the mobile games are sort of cheaper to develop, and so there's a level of experimentation there that, you know, is more sort of addressable. But then also you sort of have this problem with mobile in a way that I think particularly on mobile, the way the Japanese play mobile games compared to how non-Japanese or certainly Westerners play mobile games is sort of very different. Whereas if you know you're making a console game, you sort of have to make it work everywhere. I mean, that's so you sort of have so mobile has that more flexibility, but equally that sort of, I think it has more sort of stratified audiences. And I guess pretty much every Final Fantasy game has probably, I was going to say, sold more in Japan than not in Japan. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but you would think, you know, broadly a lot of its sort of hardcore audience is more Japanese than it would be.
Definitely. And looking at the performance of different Final Fantasy games, as I was kind of looking through them, they're always performing much better in Japan, where in Japan gachas are more favorably looked at, whereas here in the West, not so much. People tend to shun them. And especially like the console game audience. So you have to remember that these fans of this IP, they've played console games from like if they became fans somewhere between 1 and 12, they've never had the in-app purchases in those games. So they grew up that this is like a whole game, and any additional monetization feels like a scam for them or a ripoff. But still, you know, there are those success stories that still resonate in the West as well. I listed a lot of those games that were not received so well, but there are good games performing well. You know, Brave Exvius doing quite well. Brave Exvius War of the Visions, also sort of spin off from that mobile title. Then Dissidia Opera Omnia doing well, and the Final Fantasy 15, you know, A New Empire, the 4X game. I don't know how, but it found its audience. Like if I consider Final Fantasy gamer, I don't think them as like a 4X type of player, but it's an audience.
That was quite an interesting one, wasn't it? Because actually so Machine Zone, sort of at the height of its power, was doing these sort of massive, complex sort of 4X games with sort of, you know, very mainstream advertising around it as its sort of UA funnel. And then they signed a deal with Square to do, but basically reskin one of their 4X games as a Final Fantasy game, which is sort of interesting in and of itself, that Square in its sort of, you know, I'm going to say allow someone to do that. Obviously, you know, to do those sort of things, those licensing deals are to make money, but equally there was, you know, there was, I think with those Machine Zone 4X games, there was, even at the time, they weren't greatly loved among most people. People who played them sort of loved them, but it was an interesting, use of the Final Fantasy license. But then there's actually been another one, which I don't think has been quite so successful. There's actually two 4X games from Machine Zone using the Final Fantasy license. So that is sort of interesting. It shows that nothing to do with RPGs, but there is amongst maybe a small subset of people who really like playing and paying for games. That actual Final Fantasy is a license that really works in a way that you wouldn't think it would. So that's a sort of a positive to the flexibility of the license to attract an audience.
I think that's one of the kind of success elements for these games, that the Final Fantasy mobile games that have done well. If we look at Brave Exvius, it was developed by Alim, which were the makers of the Brave Frontier game. And so this Brave Exvius Final Fantasy game is basically like a reskin of the Brave Frontier game, but now with Final Fantasy and all the additional fancy, animations, the CGI attacks, and that's the game that introduced us to collaboration characters of Ariana Grande and Katy Perry, who are now Final Fantasy characters as well. And then the War of the Visions, a spin-off of the Brave Exvius, that's developed by Gumi, and those are the makers of the Alchemist Code game, which was really popular, this grid-based RPG game in Japan. It did okay in the West, but it's killed now. But once again, this game is pretty much reskin of that game. So there is like an existing concept that they then mix with this Final Fantasy IP, and if there is enough of like overlap with like interest for players, then they tend to succeed quite well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point where you have these. I mean, Brave Frontiers is a sort of a prime example, I suppose, of an incredibly successful game. Pretty much just in Japan, didn't sort of Western audiences, unless you were really into JRPGs, just, it wasn't mass market there. But Final Fantasy is sort of that license that you can take something that sort of works at least to some audience, and then Final Fantasy, by putting that license on it, that's sort of you're going to attract 10 times more people to at least download it and see what on earth it's like. So it's sort of a very interesting sort of global play on that. And as you also point out, I think going back to the sort of the experimentation that Square Enix does on mobile, my impression is all those games there you just mentioned, Square wasn't developing in them; they were sort of publishing them, but they had well-known Japanese developers sort of taking their style of game and then putting the Final Fantasy in there. And as you say, the thing, Final Fantasy games are often these sort of characters fighting against evil. It's a bit of a sort of cliched sort of thing, but those characters always have sort of interesting enough sort of interpersonal relationships, which I guess is something else, which is a characteristic of the Final Fantasy games, that the sort of setting doesn't really matter there, but the sort of, even if the storytelling, all that FMV stuff is somewhat a bit of a cliche, it actually sort of works. It sort of, they seem to elevate the story and the plot and the characters to a sort of higher level, which maybe is again another sort of characteristic of that franchise. Because I guess looking at JRPGs on a very broad scale, the other big comparison in Japan is Dragon's Quest, which is equally as big in Japan, but just never has worked in the West for reasons.
Maybe the Final Fantasy aesthetics work better for the Western audience. But you mentioned these were, a lot of these were mentioned were created by other companies than Square, but Square Enix has also had a good hit game developed by themselves for mobile, the Mobius Final Fantasy, which was created by the big stars of the company, who are like, there's the current brand manager for Final Fantasy was producer there, and the people that worked on that game are now working on the upcoming Final Fantasy VII Rebirth game. So really filling big boots, and they had made big mainline games before. So when you put the best people to work on these those people that have made those great console games, when you put them to make the sort of mobile game that is meant to be a great experience akin to the console gaming experience, then they can create something great. And Mobius Final Fantasy was doing really well. I think part of the reason why they killed it might have been so that they can get those good people to work on the other project, which is the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy.
If there's a less experimental game that you sort of know is coming with this sort of Square stamp of approval, then you sort of push that out a little bit. I guess the other thing is we've talked a bit about the sort of the FMV, the full motion video, where you're sort of, it's sort of funny that you're sort of playing with these sort of slightly down-res characters and then suddenly do an attack, and these beautiful sort of graphics come into play, which obviously back in the day of Final Fantasy sort of 7, that was the big thing, and that was because you couldn't run those graphics in real time. Whereas obviously now you can, but it's still that sort of nostalgia, even though technically you could do it all in FMV, I suppose. That's funny, but I guess another characteristic of it is the audio and the music and all that sort of stuff, which again is sort of something that those games always have. They never have a bad soundtrack. I mean, that's that's the absolute sort of, you're going to start with good music.
Yeah, it's Final Fantasy soundtracks. Those are always great, and I think that's also one thing that sort of makes the games stick in your memory, because when there are those impactful moments in the games, when you hear the music in those, and the music is memorable, and it also hits to your feels whenever you're listening to that soundtrack, when you're at gym or running or commuting or whatever you are doing, working, then you remember those moments, and it just builds the connection better. So music, the sounds are always definitely important.
So you've been playing a lot of Ever Crisis, the latest one. Do you want to go into a bit of detail on that? Obviously based in the Final Fantasy VII classic sort of world.
So the Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, it's a really interesting experiment from Square Enix. I think it's doing okay now, the little bit that we've seen its performance. But what the game does is it tries to compile all of these different additions to the Final Fantasy VII world into a single mobile game. So what they have done is they've remade the Final Fantasy VII original story. They've also remade like Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, which is the prequel one. Then there's also currently in the game original story from the First Soldier, which was the failed battle royale game. But there is like a storyline about that game, which is sort of the mobile only part of the story. But what they can do, and what they are planning on doing, is also introducing playable content from the movie Advent Children, and the novels Traces of Two Pasts or On the Way to Smile. So these stories that are not playable, and novels I think most fans of Final Fantasy VII have not even read. So bring those new things in there. Really nice experiment on how to bring like a console game IP to mobile. And the gameplay, I think the core gameplay is passable. Like, it's fun, but soon you move it to auto battle. So it's nice that it's easy to auto, but you can still kind of affect it. So it shouldn't get too boring, but it's I have to see a little bit of fan reactions, like how they take it. I think there's enough customizability through like what skills you can put in there, that the fans will be okay with it. And I think it is a good mix, but it remains to be seen. Story, obviously the source material is really good, but then when you get to the First Soldier story, you kind of feel that it is the mobile game story, because it sort of starts lagging in that there's a lot of this discussion that doesn't lead to anything when compared to the original source materials, the 7. It just, here's this important moment, here's this next important moment. So it's constantly moving. So you feel what is mobile only.
How about monetization? Have you got a sort of feel of where it sits for that?
There is something really interesting with that. So usually characters are what you get through gachas, but in this game, you unlock characters automatically. So there's no monetization related to unlocking the characters, but what you do unlock through gachas is the weapons for them and sort of the skins for the character or armor, but you can use them also as skins. So that is really interesting, and the way the gachas are done, you have the gachas which give you those weapons, but if you want those armors, they are not obtainable through the like gacha drops, but there is a separate sort of stamp system. So with each pull, you get from 1 to 12 stamps, and I think every 12 stamps you can get the skin of the armor or skin for a character. So it's going to take a lot of different, you have to pull multiple times to get those skins, and I think that feature might be something that will be turning off many console players that come from those games and are not accustomed to gacha monetization. It can get a little bit frustrating because there is the random element on top of the random element.
Well, did you say that's very in the Japanese mobile gaming psyche? I mean, that's,
yeah.
They invented it, and as other territories or other developers are sort of moving away from it in various forms. It doesn't seem like that's they're just doubling down on gachas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a cultural thing, I suppose, isn't it?
On other monetization aspects, Battle Pass, it's there. It feels a little bit like an afterthought. I don't feel, well, you get valuable items out of it, but it's sort of forgettable. Then subscription plans, they have a couple of those, but they last for 7 days. And I think the price point was something closer to $10 for 7 days, and I think that might feel a little bit steep for many players. And the value, well, it increases your rewards from the quest. So if you're going on a 7-day grind fest, then it could be definitely worth it. But I think many players will ignore those. Interestingly, for the weapons that you obtain from the gacha, the game has the highest rarity levels that I've ever seen on mobile games. So basically, you have you obtain 3-star weapons that can be upgraded to 5-star, but then on top of those 5 stars, you can overboost them. So you can first overboost them to 10 stars, then to 15 stars. And then I think after the 15 stars, this is based on what I saw in achievements, there is like 15 stars plus 20 that you need to reach to get a certain achievement. So I think you can go up to 35 stars. And before this, the biggest I remember was 10 maybe in mobile games. So they are going really next level. Kind of like Final Fantasy Brave Exvius War of the Visions surprised me with their gachas. Like usually you have maybe 5 gacha banners, maybe 10 at most, but I remember when I was analyzing one event for them from that game, and they had like 60 different gacha banners, and I'm like, why do you need this many?
A Final Fantasy game would be the one, particularly a Final Fantasy 7 based sort of experience would be the one where you kind of think somehow the nostalgia kicks in to some of these maybe middle-aged players who remember playing it on the PlayStation and go, yeah, there we go. So,
yeah, at least there's spending depth there.
I guess sort of something else in passing is interesting when I was just sort of looking through on the App Store to see the Final Fantasy games and see all this sort of list of stuff. And as you say, a lot of the games you've mentioned have sort of been in for a couple of years, or and then sort of come out off as many mobile games sort of are, if they're not, if economic to run them. But still, the vast majority of the games sitting on there are sort of premium games. So it is interesting that you could almost see any sort of new Final Fantasy free-to-play game being launched is sort of also sort of highlighting the fact that you've got like maybe 10 of the old remakes of all the games that are, I think they range from up to sort of $20, $25 for the most expensive ones, sitting there as premium games, which I presume people are still buying those, because why wouldn't they?
Yeah, the nostalgia there. It's nice. Personally, I prefer purchasing them on consoles because that's where I've played them. That's where I feel most comfortable playing them. But having them available on mobile, it's something people can then play in the plane. They don't need internet connection. For most of them, from 1 to 9, I think the remakes are there for the PlayStation up to PlayStation 1 era's end. But then they've also made Final Fantasy 13 games for mobile, but those are cloud versions. So since cloud gaming never really got going that much, at least yet, those were interesting experiments, but forgettable.
So at the beginning, you sort of mentioned there were some sort of conclusions for you thought for sort of developers. What are those then? Let's really broaden it out.
Biggest thing to learn maybe from these Final Fantasy mobile games, when you look at them, the successful ones play to the key strengths of the IP. So if you're making a console game, mobile game, and I think many, at least Sony was very interested in this. If you're trying to make a sort of like a mobile gamey, then it just doesn't resonate with your core audience. So if I take, for example, Horizon Zero Dawn, you're hunting these massive robot dinosaurs and animals with Aloy. If you take that concept into mobile and you sort of go like, okay, everyone plays match 3s on mobile, so let's make match 3 with Aloy and friends. It just doesn't resonate with your audience because there's not much to match. Now, if you make it, say, base building 4X game, where you're fighting wars between these different tribes, still a little bit different than what the core IP is, but there is sort of that appeal that, okay, there were those tribes, they were having these conflicts, so and there is an interesting setting to this that could resonate to maybe new audiences and resonate also with the older fans. But if you want to make it really appeal to the fans of the IP, then you would really need to have sort of like an action RPG where you're aiming for these different weaknesses of these robot dinosaurs and doing these stealth missions, and it just needs to have the kind of same feeling, the same kind of storytelling. The more you can bring it like the source material, the better, because that's sort of, if we look at the Final Fantasy Brave Exvius War of the Visions, it pretty much is Final Fantasy Tactics but with free-to-play mechanics. And it resonated really well when it was launched. And they knew what they were aiming for because they launched it with the Final Fantasy Tactics collaboration. So really highlighting for the fans of that IP that here is similar kind of game, and you should be excited for this. Because we have seen these oversimplified games. There are a couple of these endless runners, about Crash Bandicoot or Sackboy. Sure, there is a little bit of overlap there, but those were more like platformers instead of endless runners. So you need to have more like a full control of the character for it to feel exciting for fans of the IP.
That may be why a battle royale, Final Fantasy battle royale, doesn't work, because that's clearly just about sort of the shooting, and that's not, the characters are there. Obviously, you're running around with the characters. Whereas, as I remember from the 4X game, okay, 4X isn't about characters, but it was a very sort of heavy use of the sort of characters sort of popping up on the screen, and you sort of you sort of felt they were sort of playing into that in a way, and sort of making the most of the fact that Final Fantasy is sort of about the characters.
Mobile gamers these days, even the more casual ones, are used to more complex mechanics. So oftentimes we might think that, okay, it's simple mobile game touchscreen, maybe keep it as simple as possible, but people are looking for entertainment, and they are used to handling their mobile phones, doing stuff with them. So you can be more brave with the mechanics. You don't have to necessarily oversimplify it.
And I guess it's sort of not everyone has the resources of a Square, but clearly at that level, Square have been very good at experimenting with their IP and sort of seeing what works. And I guess, you know, mobile still is that place where the cost of experimenting, well, while it's risen a lot in the last few years, it's still, you know, it's still a good place to experiment with finding audiences and sort of doing new things.
Well, we're always talking about the hybridization and, you know, mini games popping up in games, but if we think of the most memorable Final Fantasy games, you know, there are those mini games that you remember. It's not just purely that you do the same progress in the story and you fight the battles, but there are these moments where you play the game different. You know, for Final Fantasy VII, you have the bike chase, you have the submarine hunt, you have snowboarding. For some reason, after a very tragic moment, you're happily snowboarding. And for Final Fantasy X, you have Blitzball that you play, and in Final Fantasy VIII, you do card games, and also in 9. Those are the things that really resonate. So maybe they take that as a learning for your mobile games as well, that you can have these different kind of moments to sort of balance the game experience, because people like different things, and it's fun to have a sort of break from the grind, doing something completely different. But if you manage to keep the player within the game during those break moments, that helps them to build connection with the game more.
Cool, good. Well, covered a lot of stuff there. You feel like you're emptied of Final Fantasy now. You've dumped your expertise into the podcast.
Yeah, yeah, maybe. Now I'm just itching to play all these Final Fantasy games that I mentioned. I want to go back and maybe boot up my PlayStation 5 and continue a little bit more on Final Fantasy 6.
Always good to fire up the appetite for more gaming. That's what we want to do on the podcast. Thank you very much, Teemu. That was great.
Thank you.
And thank you to you for listening, watching to the podcast, however you are consuming it. Every episode we are digging into the world of mobile gaming, which is ever dynamic and ever changing. And we've got some good episodes coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe. But thanks for watching this one, and see you next time. Goodbye.